special welcome to Professor Ursula Hoadley's family and friends. I am Professor Ewani Ramugondo, currently serving as Deputy Vice Chancellor for Transformation, Student Affairs and Social Responsibility at UCT. It is a great honor and a sincere pleasure to welcome you to this special occasion, which is part of our 2025 UCT Inaugural Lecture Series. Inaugural lectures are a long-standing and much-cherished tradition at UCT. They represent more than just a formal academic milestone. They are a moment of celebration, a time to acknowledge the scholarly achievements of those who have attained full professorship and can reflect on the significance of their work within the broader academic and societal context. I must emphasize this point of reflection. It shouldn't surprise us that it takes one attaining full professorship to be able to look back and tell a coherent story about the body of work that represents their journey as an academic. So today, we probably will be hearing for the first time Professor Hoadley sharing that journey. You know, we have this inaugural lectures on our calendar, and we take it for granted that people will just come and take the opportunity. But we know that for the one giving the lecture, it is a great opportunity, a moment to share that story. So I hope, Professor Hoadley, you're looking forward to this day. This lecture offers a unique opportunity to engage directly with the intellectual contributions of our professors, whose research and teaching continue to shape disciplines and sometimes the academy as a whole, influence policy and inspire future generations. At UCT, we take great pride in the values that underpin our academic community. Guided by Vision 2030, we strive to unleash human potential to create a fairer, inclusive, and just society. This vision speaks not only to the transformative role of the university in society, but also to the transformative power of education itself. Inaugural lectures are powerful moments in which this vision comes alive, where we see the impact of rigorous scholarship, thoughtful engagement, and meaningful contribution in action. Tonight, we are gathered to celebrate such a moment in the academic journey of Professor Ursula Hoadley, a scholar who has spent nearly 3 decades immersed in the world of classrooms, working tirelessly to understand and illuminate the complexities of learning and teaching, particularly within contexts shaped by inequality and poverty. Her lecture this evening, titled Life in Classrooms, Understanding Interruption and Enhancement Through Pedagogy, promises to challenge us to think critically about how education functions in society. It will examine the realities of pedagogy, how it can reproduce social inequities and serve as a powerful tool for their disruption. Professor Hoadley's work invites us to to ask essential questions. What actually happens in classrooms? Why do certain teaching practices persist despite policy shifts? How do educators adapt or fail to adapt to changing demands? These questions are not only theoretical, they are deeply practical and relevant to the future of education, particularly in the global south. Before Professor Hoadley is formally introduced, I want to welcome the platform party. We have our acting Dean, Jaya, who will introduce our speaker. And then our speaker will take the platform, and in response, we will have someone who needs no introduction, Professor Jonathan Jansen. He can't wait. I'd also like to take the moment again to acknowledge Professor Hoadley's family, friends, and colleagues who are with us tonight. Your presence here, David, and the two daughters, I believe you are 14 and 16 apart. I'm sure you will enjoy your mom's lecture. Just making sure that I've got this right. It's Grace and Malaika, right? Okay, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Your engagement with this lecture reflects the spirit of curiosity, critical inquiry, and public dialogue that we deeply value at UCT. As we reflect on the theme of tonight's lecture, I'm reminded of the enduring words of Paulo Freire, who once said, "Education either functions as an instrument to bring about conformity or freedom." Professor Hoadley's career has been a profound call to choose freedom in how we teach, learn, and strive for justice. It is now my pleasure to invite Professor, the acting Dean, Jaya, to the podium.
Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Professor Elawani Ramagondo, Professor Jonathan Jansen, colleagues, friends, and family of Professor Hoadley. Good evening to you all. Today we are privileged to have the inauguration of a leading scholar in curriculum and pedagogy, the heart and pulse of the education system. Professor Hoadley's scholarship is widely respected for its foundational role in what later came to be known as curriculum studies, giving it much of the theoretical base that it lacked in its earlier phases. For this, she is rightly recognized by her colleagues across the world. Her work is constantly in conversation with and measured against that of seminal figures in the fields such as Basil Bernstein and Michael Young. And we are indeed honored to have our own luminary here. These scholars have constantly demonstrated the revolutionary power of grounding the capacity of students in teaching and learning and the attainment of their potential when centered. In a country like South Africa, where students are confronted by many challenges owing to our past and its afterlives, having someone like Professor Hoadley is a distinct advantage. Her work has reached policy circles where she's able to provide ample evidence in demonstrating understanding and appreciation for the lived experiences of learners in developing teaching appropriate tools. Professor Hoadley's depth of empirical grounding is impressive. She has, over the years, collaborated with academics outside of her field in order to demonstrate intricate crossover manifestations that show up in the classroom. Most notably, she has collaborated with a team of economists to demonstrate the cost of inequality in learning outcomes of learners and how this in turn recreates the cycle in path dependencies. To break this chain, her work has shown that only the strongest foundation is fundamental to building just societies, a point that South Africa is very far from, unfortunately. Fortunately for us, as her home institution, for her colleagues in her field, and for the policy-making circles in South Africa, we are lucky that Professor Hoadley's research is grounded in many years that she has spent in classrooms as a school teacher first, and then later as a researcher up to a professorial level. We must value the several appointments she received in ministerial task teams to evaluate previous experiments, such as the infamous outcomes-based education, while playing an advisory role on future implementation plans that are homegrown and suitable. We should listen to Professor Hoadley to properly reflect on the changes we need to make. There aren't many people who are as qualified as she is to give us tonight's lecture, a lecture that has been in the making for over 30 years of combined experiences. Her extensive publication record and high-impact publications speaks for itself, shining in both quantitative and qualitative research methods, making her work uniquely strong as a reference point, as evidenced by how widely influential her work is in her field. The extremely fundamental role of mentorship and supervision by Professor Hoadley is praised by her students and colleagues, who all recognize the quality of her guidance for future practitioners in the field. Some of them are here in the audience tonight, and I'm sure that this night is for them, their night of success too, as well as for her family, of course, who have supported her throughout and had to endure many hours spent away from them while she was in service of our country's deeply challenged education system. As an institution, we are pleased that Professor Hoadley has chosen us as her academic home, and it is indeed an honor to welcome Professor Hoadley to the stage to tell us about life in classrooms. Professor Hoadley.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Professor Reddy and Professor Ramagunda, for that very warm and generous welcome. There are a few corrections I have to make, but I'll get to those when along the line. And thank you, everyone who's come tonight. It's wonderful to see you all, and a special thank you to Professor Jansen, who's come to respond to my talk. Special welcome to my family, and to my sister, and to my many friends and colleagues and students here tonight. It's wonderful to have everybody gathered in the same room. And I'm grateful to have this opportunity to speak about my work to people from different parts of my life, although it makes my job a whole lot more difficult. So I'm just going to jump in at the deep end, and very briefly, because I want to start, if I can move the slide. I want to start with two key ideas that have framed my work. We have for a long time been aware of the reproductive function of schooling, that the education a person receives is strongly tied to their social and economic circumstances. Schooling reproduces social inequalities and largely fails to provide enhanced life opportunities to those who need them most. In a neoliberal world, this understanding becomes largely normalized. You get better teachers, teaching and knowledge if you pay more, or you can push your way to the front of the opportunity line. The more advantaged you are, the greater the educational opportunities you are likely to have. In education, there have been numerous attempts to critique and counteract these ideas, and these have generally focused on the importance of teacher agency, student agency, identity, representation. The critique is often focused on the repressive nature of specialized knowledge, specifically, and how it is taught. And the arguments have often turned around the importance of focusing on relevant knowledge, on indigenous or local understandings. A different counterpoint to the reproduction thesis is Basil Bernstein's ideas around pedagogy as the specialization of consciousness, drawing attention to the centrality of specialized knowledge and understanding schooling as both reproduction and interruption. While the process of transferring specialized knowledge from one person to another, i.e. pedagogy, is often repressive and excluding, gaining access to specialized knowledge, to complex, powerful ways of thinking, holds the potential for the interruption of reproductive processes. Learning entails acquiring, an abstracting orientation, a conceptual language to order our social worlds, to condense past understandings and to open up possible futures, to challenge and transform present realities. I've spent my career trying to understand how processes of curriculum and pedagogy contribute to reproducing inequalities, but I've also centered this notion of interruption. Okay, so that's a bit of a heavy start for some of you, I know, but I've got to get it out there. The span of my career broadly maps onto three major curriculum reforms that followed the end of the apartheid. So the story I'll tell this evening is one of macro changes in the education system in relation to curriculum policy change and micro studies of what I found was happening in classrooms over time. I've also structured my talk in relation to a series of questions that Professor Ramagunda introduced and that have also framed my work over time. And these are: what goes on in South African classrooms? How do classroom processes differ across different social contexts? Are there classrooms that are beating the odds? Are there programs that can radically change classroom practices and alter the educational trajectory of learners? Why do certain pedagogic forms persist? My talk is part scholarly account of my research in schools, but it's also part personal story of the journey I have taken into the sociology of education and study of curriculum and pedagogy specifically. I do this because in preparing for this lecture, I was aware of how every one of my projects, questions, and ideas were shaped and sustained with others. And though I'm unable to mention everyone I would like to, I want to reflect the research endeavor as personal, communal, and collaborative. In my presentation, I will also show photographs that I've taken over the years of schools and classrooms that I've spent time in, all ethical permissions having been observed, of course. So I started primary school in 1978, deep in the shadows of apartheid. Race, class, and unequal schooling opportunities framed my childhood impressions of schooling. My first 3 years of school were at a whites-only government primary school on the East Rand of Gauteng. I remember it as a dusty brown school with a yellow plaid uniform. There were lots of immigrant children at the school, especially Lebanese and Greek, children who would have been classified as poor white in the language of the time. My father was an engineer on the mines, and on weekends we would sometimes go with him to the huge workshop for the mine foundries. There I remember encountering the children of workers who went to school in the nearby township of Davidton. We would occasionally play together among the many stray kittens roaming the workshop, but our different languages made real conversation difficult. Then there was the schooling of my sisters and I, who later attended elite private schools in Johannesburg. This experience of schooling was very different to that of our mother, who reminded us periodically of her barefoot farm schooling outside Oudtshoorn. It was very different from the gardener who lived on our property, who had a standard 6, and worlds apart from his children in the Bantustan of Kwandebele, who visited periodically, mostly not attending school. And different again from my father's schooling at the oldest public school in Johannesburg, JP Boys High, which ironically had been established earlier by the Anglican Church to educate the children of mine workers on the Witwatersrand. This was apartheid schooling, a complex, highly fragmented and unequal system, offering different possibilities for a change in life chances. After completing a BA, it was during my teaching diploma, doing an HDE at UCT, that some of the implicit and crude understandings of unequal schooling I had formed until then began to crystallize. My lecturer in the Sociology of Education course, David Gilmore, showed us excerpts from the famous documentary series 7 Up. And I'm sure most of you who've done a PGC at UCT would have watched 7 Up. The series follows the lives of 14 children from very different class backgrounds in England, beginning in the early 60s up until they turned 63. The series showed in a very determinative way how the social class paths of students were set from the start. Shown in 1964, it begins with the words, we brought these children together, thank you, because we brought these children together, so this is in 1964, we brought these children together because we wanted a glimpse of England in the year 2000. The shop steward and the executive of the year 2000 are now 7 years old. The documentary had a profound impact on me at the time. How was it that social origins mapped, lost my place. How was it that social origins were undisturbed by schooling and instead mapped so predictably onto people's life chances? Could it be otherwise? Thinking back on my own schooling, the most extraordinary teacher I'd had was Mrs. Lemmer in grade 2 at my first scruffy government primary school. How did the reproduction script play out in South Africa? Wanting to understand more, I chose not to be a teacher. I went straight on to do a master's, and after graduating, I got my first job in 1998. At the time, in the late 1990s, and just emerging from apartheid, schools were experiencing what was commonly referred to at the time as a breakdown in the culture of teaching and learning. Up until then, there had been very little classroom-based research. Oh, thanks. However, I can talk from down here as well. However, the few accounts that had gone behind the classroom door were from apartheid inspectors, some biographical accounts from teachers, and a few reports from NGO projects that had been running in schools. So there was an urgent need to know what the problems in the culture of teaching and learning were at the classroom level in the first instance before trying to fix them. Then President Mandela raised significant international funding and launched the President's Educational Initiative. Under the leadership of Nick Taylor and Penny Vinjeveld, the PEI, as it became known, involved 37 projects commissioned to understand what was going on in classrooms. Heather Jacklin led one of the projects and hired my present colleague, Xolisa Guzula, who many of you know, as researchers. The project was, look, what's funny? Sorry. Oh, yeah, that's hilarious. The project was located in a set of primary and high schools in Khayelitsha. We sat for days at the school gates, in assemblies, in staff rooms, and crucially in classrooms, trying to map the factors that impacted on how students progressed through their schooling. This was 1999, just after the implementation of Curriculum 2005, the first post-apartheid curriculum. This curriculum was a huge shift from the traditional subject-based and content-heavy apartheid curriculum. What it did was it tested out in an extreme form many of the radical and progressive educational ideas that were around at the time, throwing out almost all academic subject-based knowledge. The boundaries between school knowledge and everyday knowledge were dissolved, as was thinking in terms of mental and manual divides. Curriculum 2005 was designed on outcomes-based or OBE principles. Teachers were given generic statements of skills. For example, show critical awareness of language use, and they had to attach localized relevant content to those. Or as the DBE put it, where no thought is given to the existing curriculum, instead schools or local districts are told they can choose any content and use a wide range of teaching methods, as long as these develop citizens who display the agreed upon critical outcomes. Learner-centeredness was also a key principle, and textbooks were seen as antithetical to this and associated with the apartheid past. So there were no books provided, despite the urgent need for material in African languages especially, and the curriculum relied heavily on the teacher as the curriculum maker. At the grade 1 level, no guidance was given to teachers on how to teach reading or early number. The pupil envisioned in the curriculum was one who could already read or who would naturally catch the ability simply by being in school. Early maths was not understood as a predetermined body of knowledge, but rather as this construction of knowledge, and there was a strong emphasis on the mathematization of everyday life and on relevance. Teachers were expected to fill in the content and concept gaps left by the curriculum. Curriculum 2005 was an act of political symbolism, as Jonathan Jansen argued, to signal transformation rather than being about changing practice. Pedagogically, it was a failure. It assumed high levels of expertise from teachers, a blind spot that is startling given the history from which the system had just emerged. When generic skills replaced formal knowledge, the rules of the schooling game were hidden from those teachers and learners who most needed to access them. In relation to pedagogy, the PE project that we were involved in was concerned with the first question identified for this address: what goes on in South African classrooms? In the grade 1 classrooms where Xoli, Heather, and I spent days observing, we saw a lot of time spent on waiting, eating, and singing. An oral discourse predominated in chorused responses to low-level questions or chanted rhymes by the whole class. This collective chanting and call and response, as we see on the slide here, was a defining feature of the classrooms. The pedagogy did not provide learners with different ways of seeing their world other than what they experienced in their homes and communities. Not once over the long days of observations were learners exposed to or required to handle books. We saw 2 teachers read from the Bible, and it was October, and around a quarter of the learners that we observed couldn't write their own names. Here was stark evidence of a reproductive pedagogy that failed to provide learners with the means for organizing their world in new ways. At its most simple and devastating level, teachers had stopped explicitly and systematically teaching their students to read, write, count, and calculate. One of the grade 1 teachers explained that in the new curriculum, in maths, for instance, the teacher does not have to tell the kids that today we are going to learn fractions. It automatically enters into the lesson. A large portion of time in these classrooms was simply spent waiting. I have an abiding memory from this time, which Xoli will remember, I'm sure. I was sitting with Heather and Xolisa in a secondary classroom when Xoli started laughing and we asked her why. She said she had overheard a student looking at Heather and I ask her friend why white people dressed so badly. It was memorable. in that the layering of race, class, language, insider-outsider positionality, and the ever-present humor in the harshest of conditions are complex dynamics that have shaped and continue to shape my work in classrooms over the years. The PEI program and its 37 projects was an important and consequential initiative, highlighting the problems of Curriculum 2005, especially its outcomes-based design and its backgrounding of school knowledge and texts. The initiative led to the establishment of a review under Minister Asmal a mere 2 years after its implementation, and it was revised after that. For me personally, I wasn't involved in that review, there's another correction, but for me personally, the PEI research was formative in my interest in early grade classrooms and in how teaching itself and what went on in classrooms appeared to function as a significant cog in the reproductive machinery. Although I didn't quite phrase it like that at the time. I knew that what we had observed in Khayelitsha was very different to what went on in more affluent classrooms. I wanted to explore this more precisely and embarked on a PhD. I decided that the best way to understand what was going on in different contexts was to select extreme cases. So for my PhD research, I selected a set of schools in Khayelitsha and a set in leafy middle-class Rondebosch, and my research interest shifted from the question of the PEI question of what is going on in classrooms to how do classroom processes differ across different social contexts. The classrooms I chose were at opposite ends of the social class continuum, and the intention was to try and put differences starkly on display, to understand theoretically to what extent and in what ways the pedagogy differed. Was it in what was offered, the knowledge content, or in how it was offered? Certainly there were big differences in resourcing, and students also came to classrooms very differently prepared for learning by their domestic circumstances. This home subsidy was crystal clear in Rondebosch schools, and I would later conclude that it wasn't that teachers here were working a special pedagogic magic. They relied to a large extent on what children walked into the classroom with already. But there were two key differences in the pedagogy that stood out in the early grade maths and reading lessons I observed. The first was the kind of knowledge that predominated in the classrooms. In Khayelitsha classrooms, teachers mostly circulated the knowledge that learners were already familiar with, the experiential understandings, things we'd seen in the PEI, rhymes, songs, concrete meanings, the everyday knowledge. In Rondebosch schools, school knowledge, abstracted skills, general definitions and meanings dominated. The difference can be seen starkly in this example of student work. On the left, Rondebosch students were given a formal method of number decomposition to solve 54 minus 7, producing highly regular correct responses. On the right, we see the excruciating attempts of Khayelitsha learners to solve 313 plus 12 by drawing individual concrete counters and then counting them up, a highly inefficient strategy leading to many errors. This relationship between the everyday knowledge of learners and the more abstracted school knowledge has been a source of much debate and tension within the education research community. All children from all communities come into the classroom with rich funds of experiential knowledge, their own everyday understandings. In the pedagogic process, this knowledge needs to be recognized and included in the meanings that are generated. But the job of the school is to shift students to more context-independent ways of making meaning and to move them beyond their experiential worlds, whether those are affluent middle-class ones or rural poor contexts. Bernard Charlot, I think, is clarifying when he argues that in school the world is treated as an object of thought as opposed to a place of experience. He explains, school is a place where the world is treated as an object and not as an environment or a place of experience. The Lisbon that the geography teacher talks about should not be confused with the Lisbon in which pupils live. To a certain extent, it is the same city, but their relationship to it is not the same in the two cases. The latter is a place of experience, the former an object of thought. When pupils do not manage to make the difference between the two and relate to the former as if it was the latter, they will have problems at school. For example, the teacher asks what the functions of the city of Lisbon are, which requires that the city is thought of in its role as the capital, and pupils respond narrating how they, their parents, and their friends live in the city. The circulation of meanings that were concrete, local, and context-dependent was a fundamental way in which students learning in Khayelitsha schools were being disadvantaged in the pedagogy. Whether students were provided with access to the world as an object of thought or not was a feature of pedagogy that emerged as consequential to differential schooling processes, both in the PEI and in this research. A short aside, why is there this debate around the distinction? The difficulty that teachers always face is that with students' entry into abstract thought and the collective representations of society, is that it often creates a disturbance in the individual's subjective ways of understanding the world. Entering the world of esoteric knowledge and context-independent thought means for most students leaving something of themselves behind. This relationship between the world as a place of experience and the world as an object of thought is a key thing that has to be managed in the pedagogy. And while the specific focus here is on early grade classrooms, this has implications all the way up the system into our university lecture rooms. Part of the difficult task of pedagogy is to put knowledge into a dynamic relationship with knowers, as Mary McInhorick puts it. But back to the research and the differences between the classrooms. The second significant difference between the Khayelitsha and Rondebosch settings pertain to a central idea of progressive schooling, the notion of individualizing. To ensure student success in school, one needs to understand what a pupil knows and understands, and for each individual learner to craft an educational career trajectory. Hence, for example, small reading groups in the early grades match pupils to a particular level and provides them with readers at a liminal level to notch up their fluency levels. This is Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. And for teachers it requires they provide differentiated cognitive and affective support for student learning. What defined the pedagogy in the Khayelitsha classrooms, as in the PEI project, was what I defined as a communalizing pedagogy, where teachers interact with the class as a homogeneous group with little to no differentiation of tasks or differentiation of individual performances. In a communalizing pedagogy, close scrutiny of what individual learners produce is not possible, and consequently the conditions for the successful production of the relevant pedagogic text are foreclosed. In plain speak, an oral discourse of communal chanting, call and response between teachers and students, tasks completed all together, the pace often set at the slowest learner, with little to no individual student questions or input, content pitched at a very low level. So two different pedagogic modalities were defined from this research: a communalizing, localizing modality and an individualizing, specializing modality in the different contexts in order to describe theoretically reproductive mechanisms in early grade classrooms, positioning learners very differently for their ongoing success in school. I pursued the ideas here, developed here, on my own, and with Paula Ensor and Joe Muller in a range of publications that over time continued to develop my understandings of social class pedagogy and knowledge. I regard myself as exceptionally fortunate to have worked with both Paula and Joe, mentors to whom across my whole career I owe my my greatest debt of gratitude. It's quite a mouthful. Greatest debt of gratitude. Someone once told me that I think it was John, in an Oedipal sense, once you've completed your PhD, you are meant to kill the father. But I'm very happy to see Paula and Joe alive in the audience this evening. And I value my continued friendship and intellectual engagement with them both. The timing of the research that I've covered was around 2003, when the first curriculum 2005 had been reformed and we had a hybrid curriculum, somewhere between a more traditional subject-based curriculum, but with significant vestiges of the radical learner-centered, content-free curriculum 2005. So things could literally swing either way in curriculum policy terms, and very different pedagogies emerged in different classrooms. The research had set out to put these differences deliberately on display and fed into broad arguments at the time around the problems with an underspecified curriculum, especially in a system emerging from apartheid where schooling processes had been decimated and teaching capacity deliberately crippled. In these conditions, teachers in middle-class contexts could rely on an internalized script that they'd gained from training and on what learners brought into the classroom from their home. What the majority of teachers needed, however, was clear direction and support in what and how to teach. This was also the call that teachers made in the deliberations of the 2009 ministerial review of the curriculum, which I participated in. And Penny will also remember the provincial hearings with huge halls of teachers, all calling for clarity on what to teach and when and how. And thus was born in 2012 the third post-apartheid curriculum, the Curriculum Assessment and Assessment Policy Statement, or the CAPS. In the CAPS review process, the review team argued that a knowledge-based curriculum is essential for differentiating subjects and delineating subject-specific skills, concepts, and content, which need to be taught. With subjects came back the content and criteria for teaching and learning. So we now had a knowledge-based curriculum. It was highly specified, what to teach for how long and when, with very clear prescriptions for all subjects, and clear, albeit debatable, guidelines on how to teach reading. What likely impact would there be on pedagogy? As a parent, I had spent a lot of time in classrooms not conducive to learning. And I wanted to know whether there were classrooms that were able to interrupt what seemed to be grinding processes of social reproduction in classrooms. So my next large project, the Schools Performing Against Demographic Expectations, or SPADE project, posed the third question of this address. What was happening in schools and classrooms that were beating the odds? Were there schools in poor communities where teachers and their students were managing to get good outcomes? Working closely with a group of colleagues, including my longtime friend and collaborator, Jamir Galant, and SAST van den Berg at Stellenbosch, we identified a set of schools in which to explore these questions. While we found some differences in management practices in outlier schools, we found few differences in the pedagogies within and across schools. Conducted from 2012 to 2014, the project took place at the time of the implementation of the CAPS. Focusing again on early grade classrooms, there was evidence of more structure to lessons and subjects were clearly demarcated, so maths was distinct from reading. There was also a lot more text available in classrooms. However, the communalizing form remained largely undisturbed in most classrooms. The pacing remained very slow, often pegged at the level of the slowest learner. Learners spoke very little, rarely asked questions. There was no matching of instruction to individual learners' levels, and teachers sometimes took on the form of a more individualized practice, like small groups, but the substance within these groups remained largely the same. Collective completion of tasks, chorused reading, and no individual feedback. There was a substantial amount of research around this time confirming what had been known since the PEI project. That teachers lacked the subject knowledge and instructional expertise needed to teach reading and early maths. Efforts to upskill teachers since the end of apartheid had been completely insufficient, and it was apparent that changes in curriculum alone could not produce significant shift. Around this time, I also began working closely with several development economists, especially Nick Small, Gabby Wills, and SAST van den Berg, resulting in a long and happy interdisciplinary marriage of education theory and small-scale puzzling, that's me, I don't do quantitative work, with large-scale data sets and systems thinking. One of our projects, Succeeding Against Odds, retried the outlier design, confirming the difficulty of identifying outlier primary schools and finding then differences in them. The source of the difficulty of finding outlier schools was partly in the fact that there's no external assessment of primary schools like there is for the matric. But classrooms in challenging contexts also seem to be functioning in very similar ways, maintaining a kind of low-level equilibrium that Brian Ramadero describes as exemplified by teacher absenteeism and foot dragging. Despite concerted efforts to fix the curriculum, to set down what we wanted the next generation to know, and to signal curriculum requirements clearly to teachers, there appeared to be minimal changes in what was happening in classrooms. In other words, there were changes in the what, in the how, not so much. This was brought into stark relief in the Succeeding Against Odds project, where we collected copious data on book availability. The unbroken spine was a common phenomenon in schools. School and classroom libraries with swathes of books that had not been opened, still wrapped in plastic or stored in locked cupboards. So I brought this account of radical curriculum reform and pedagogical status together in my book, Pedagogy in Poverty. If I've lost you along the way in this talk, now's a good time to listen up for a summary. This morning, Grace said to me, how long is your, I was feeling anxious. She said, how long is your talk, Mum? I said, it's 40 minutes. She said, don't worry, 50% of those people won't be listening. So listen now. In the book, I showed how South Africa had undergone a kind of natural experiment in curriculum reform, from a highly specified traditional subject-based curriculum under apartheid to a radically progressive learner-centered one in the early years of democracy that eschewed subjects and content specification, emphasizing integration and teachers' choice of content, and then gradually a shift back to a subject-based curriculum under the caps with strong specification. Throughout the reforms in the pedagogy, what dominated was this communalizing pedagogy that seemed largely rooted in teachers' limited access to specialized knowledge for teaching. Although it seemed to be a rather pessimistic account, I ended the book pointing to research that was actually showing, and still shows, some clear evidence of improvements with respect to South Africa's learning outcomes since around 2002, and especially pre-pandemic. This can be seen in the results of various international assessment programs. On perhaps the best known and the most recent data, the TIMSS study, South Africa is no longer a negative outlier. And although this improvement has been off a very low base, it has been steeper than in other countries, closing the gap in performance between South African countries similar to it. There has been a significant positive uptick as well in the number of high-level maths and science passes on our own matric assessments. It's hard to say whether this improvement derives from a stable curriculum, a very efficient school nutrition program that feeds almost 9 million kids every day, an improvement in the general stores of teacher knowledge, which the tests also show, or perhaps a drastic improvement in the availability of text and African language text in classrooms. But it does offer hope. The system is not completely broken. The book showed, though, that it is not the curriculum that is the fundamental problem, although it needs work and strengthening in multiple ways. The problem is the pedagogy through which it's developed. The book also opened up 2 additional areas of inquiry that I'd like to touch on briefly in relation to my remaining 2 questions. If there didn't seem to be very much systematic learning in classrooms, I began to think with a lot of other people in this space about whether there were programs that could radically change classroom practices. For a while, there's been a dominant approach in the early years to try and improve instruction via what are called structured pedagogy programs. These are highly structured, large-scale programs providing teachers with scripted lesson plans linked to materials to ensure coverage. Especially for reading, these programs have been rolled out all over the world, particularly in developing country contexts. Over the course of about 8 years, I worked with 2 other development economists, my dear friend Kelly Ardington here at UCT and Alicia Menendez from Chicago University, who led me through the portal into randomized control trials of these early grade reading programs. We worked in India, Liberia, South Africa, and Uganda, trying to figure out whether these scripted, structured, resource-intensive programs impacted pupils' ability to read, and if so, my job, what were the pedagogic causal mechanisms for any improvement? Oops. There's a lot to say about all of this, not least the limitations and problems with RCT designs in education. But my interest for purposes here was not on what was apparent in the classrooms that we visited. I mean, it was on what was apparent. The short account is that research confirmed the dominance of this communalized form of pedagogy across a wide range of contexts. An example from a Liberian classroom is indicative, specifying the what of pedagogy, providing a scripted lesson plan with attendant workbooks and readers, did not move the how. And it's questionable whether what we see here in this call and response pattern between the teacher and the students, whether this constitutes reading at all, although the teacher and the learners were standing with books in their hands. The call and response fragments the text to such an extent that it's unlikely students can actually retrieve meaning from what they are repeating after the teacher. The quantitative findings from these big RCTs on these programs, if you read them closely enough, show that these programs aren't leading to considerably more learners being able to read with understanding. Qualitatively, what the work showed was that in these structured pedagogy programs, progress was being made with the what. There were more books, there was a clearly specified curriculum in the lesson plans, but these were inert. How to activate them for meaningful reading acquisition remained elusive. So what was particularly interesting in all of this research was how widespread the communalized form was. Found in a wide range of country contexts. It had been dominant for a very long time and had resisted a great deal of reform efforts. And as yet, there wasn't evidence of programs that could substantially change instruction in early grade reading classrooms, especially at scale. So working with the reading NGO Fundawande and my students Nompumelelo Isaacs and Colleen Boyd, we decided finally to ask teachers themselves why these entrenched pedagogic forms persisted. How did teachers themselves understand the communalizing pedagogy, especially in the context of sustained and widespread emphasis and training on learner-centeredness, on differentiation, on individual feedback? And predictably, the answers were neither simple nor straightforward. These communalized practices were resistant to change because they were deeply rooted in history and in teachers' personal biography, how they were taught. It's the way we were taught from an early age. You're not supposed to answer when you're not asked. You cannot just jump in and say something in the middle of the talk. You don't have to ask questions, you just do because I say so. We used to read together. We used to stand by the wall and read together as a class. You won't learn how to read because you will read with the others and the teacher will think you know how to read. Reasons also refer to a lack of knowledge to do otherwise. I think it's a lack of knowledge of how to do it because, you know, the Department of Education, sometimes if we went to workshops, it's just telling. There are slides and telling you how to do it. Do this. Many of the teachers' responses acknowledged that these pedagogic forms were not optimal for learning, but were sustained because they required low effort, and low effort was rooted in low motivation due to the huge demands placed upon them. Teachers want to get done with the syllabus. It takes more time when learners do the work on their own. Teachers will be doing those tests together with the learners, giving them the answers so that it all looks correct because it's a pretense. You know, when you've not been teaching for a week, you wanted to make it look like all is well. A communalized pedagogy provided teachers with an efficient means of working under extreme duress, with large classes of vulnerable learners, broken schools and systems, and little instructional support from parents. The pedagogy enabled them to fulfill minimum curriculum coverage requirements and to keep moving things along. It's very hard to be a teacher in most South African schools. Many teachers express the lack of support, affirmation, or simply someone noticing their work. Finally, teachers made reference to the ways in which a communalizing pedagogy affirmed a collectivist culture and protected learners and teachers from the shame or the embarrassment of not knowing. Because we used to be teased by the teachers, we used to be called names, you stupid. And then some others will say, I wonder where did you get that from? Maybe it's from your family, blah, blah, blah. In cases, the learners will tease each other when they don't understand or when they hear answers that are incorrect. You can't say you are wrong in front of everyone. The communalizing form is not only a pedagogic form that has particular negative instructional implications for individual learners. It can also be thought of as part of rituals contributing to community solidarity under conditions of poverty. The issue then is not just pedagogical in any straightforward way. Communalization is not simply a dysfunctional form of pedagogy, but is embedded in a larger set of community solidarity coping mechanisms rendered necessary in harsh environments. So the problem of pedagogy lies not only in the school, but the society in which it's embedded, just like most of the intractable problems in education. But there's another way to think about the communalizing pedagogy. And if you thought I was going to make my way through a humanities inaugural address without saying the word decolonization, you were wrong. In my current project, working with Jami Galant and Shahida Jaffa, Carol Bertram and others, the MyLabs project, looking at pedagogy in high schools, as colleagues, we've been considering whether the whole progressivist idea of individualizing, attention to differentiation and individual cognitive pathways, doesn't perhaps carry an insidious colonial bias. Perhaps we need to reframe the question around communalizing pedagogies. I began this address by speaking about how education is fundamentally about the specialization of consciousness, about the development of an abstracting orientation to making sense of the world. But how can communal activity in the classroom result in the development of these individual capacities? How do we attend to internal individual cognitive processes whilst maintaining regard for the collective or the affiliative social function of chorusing, of call and response in the classroom? Can we find a calibration between a communal social form and an individualized knowledge orientation? And what might such a calibration look like? In closing, the ongoing hope for my own work with my colleagues, and especially with my students, is to find new ways of understanding the relation between a theory of the world and the experiential world itself. How to engender a sense of belonging to both, and also the capacity to interrupt, to intervene in and transform those worlds. I thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hoadley. Don't run away from the front. You're still on stage. You'll join us when we go to the front. Thank you. Thank you for taking us back down memory lane across the different era of curricular reforms since 1994. And the pedagogies that emerge from vastly unequal environments. And thank you for helping us connect with the lives in those classrooms, the lives of the teachers and the learners. Now for a response, I call upon Professor Jonathan Jansen.
Good evening, everyone. You know, in my various jobs, I'm often asked to either preside over or participate in inaugural lectures, and most times it is excruciatingly painful and boring. I hated it, but tonight I want to tell you something, that this was an intellectual feast. It was absolutely wonderful listening to Ursula do such an amazing job. You've probably listened to one of the country's finest education scholars share thinking about one of the most intractable problems in education through a focus on what really happens inside classrooms from one day to the next. Not since Philip Jackson's amazing work, Life in Classrooms, have we had, through Ursula's work, such intricate and thoughtful accounts of the routines, the rhythms, and the resonances that sustain what she calls communalizing pedagogies in South African classrooms. And generous as always, Professor Hoadley acknowledges that she stands on the shoulders of giants in curriculum theory, like Professor Joe Muller, but then politely she steps on their toes, as any good student does, to advance our thinking about knowledge beyond the received wisdoms. Now, there are three important shifts in the beyond research tantalizingly dangled before us in the conclusion, and what I sense might be the next phase of this important body of research on classroom pedagogies. One, trying to understand the logics of communalizing pedagogies from the perspective of teachers in poor and working class schools. Two, to examine the possibilities of moving from such stable pedagogies towards more abstract, individualized teaching and learning. And three, if I may be bold, inside the epistemological shrine erected to Bernstein in UCT's education community, I've never understood that, to generate new theory about stubborn pedagogies that starts with African conditions of teaching and learning, which are, I would submit, still poorly understood. I was almost thrown out of Harvard University, not by Trump, but by their professors when I taught a course there last semester, and then I had to do an obligatory lecture to the professors, and I titled it, Why B.F. Skinner Might Have Been Right. This is the behaviorist. Professor Hoadley, thank you for pointing us in these potentially fertile new directions for research. Welcome to the class of full professors. May your star continue to rise, Ursula, as you break new ground in research that offers hope not only to South Africa, but throughout the education world. And as we continue in the search for a truly liberating pedagogy that transforms the lives and the learnings of teachers and learners alike. We are proud of you. Well done.
Thank you for that aptly fitting response, Professor Jansen. And thank you, Professor Raju, for introducing our speaker. And again, Professor Hoadley, thank you for the treat that indeed the lecture was. We have reached the end of this evening's formal proceedings. So for those who thought they were missing out on what's happening at that White House, we can catch up. But before that, we hope you will take time and mingle as we share a bit of what we've prepared for you. And thank you to the family for stepping in when the ergonomics, right, in front here were putting us at risk of having our speaker get a concussion. Thank you. Thank you.
I didn't know.
You did not.
Thank you. Thank you.
I was so worried
Thank
that you will hit your head.